He collects what is owed.
The old world didn't just end, it was erased. In the Texas Panhandle, the ash is holy, and the survivors are divided into two groups, the Chosen and the Tithe. I am your narrator, and today we follow the Tithe-Taker into the gray hour before dawn. This is Red Tithe by Crystal Cosm. Welcome to the Flock. Chapter 1. The Gospel of Dust. The father said the bombs were a baptism. He said this while standing barefoot on the hood of a burned-out school bus somewhere in what used to be the Texas Panhandle. Arms spread wide, the wind pulling his white hair into something that looked worshipped. 12 of them sat in the dirt below him, cross-legged, drinking reconstituted rain from cracked plastic jugs, and they believed him the way starving people believe in food, not spiritually but biologically, at the level of marrow. The father said the old world had been a sin so total it required total erasure. He said the ash was holy. He said those who survived were either chosen or unchosen, and that the unchosen were not wasted, they were tithe. He said this while looking at Crale. Crale, who was 26 or 30, or maybe older, who had been 11 when the sky turned white and the shadows of his family were burned into the parking lot outside a Tulsa strip mall, and stayed there, permanent as love, who had walked out of the fire alone and kept walking and never really stopped. The father saw something in Crale that the others either could not see or looked away from, a particular quality of stillness, the way a good trap is still. "You are my tithe-taker," the father told him. "You are the edge of my will, made meat." Crale had nodded, not in agreement, in recognition, like a tool acknowledging its purpose. Chapter 2. What Crale Drives. The vehicle had no name because Crale did not name things he intended to keep. It had started life as a 1994 Camaro Z28, the long predatory hood, the fastback roofline, the haunches wide and low in the manner of something that had been designed, even in its civilian incarnation, to suggest consequence. Highway patrol had never touched this one. It had been someone's project car, pre-war, half-finished in a Lubbock garage when the sky went white, and Crale had found it under a tarp in the rubble 3 years into the waste, with enough of its original architecture intact to become something new. The Crale-era modifications had metabolized the donor car into something that shared only bones with what it had been. The windows were stripped and replaced with welded steel mesh, the frames reinforced with angle iron salvaged from a collapsed highway overpass. The body wore plates of boilerplate steel and, at the door panels, sections of industrial conveyor belt that absorbed low-velocity impacts without the cracking that metal developed over time. The roof had been cut away entirely and replaced with a roll cage fabricated from Schedule 40 pipe, brutal and sufficient, rising above the roofline like the ribs of something that had been turned inside out. The wheels were the vehicle's most distinctive feature. Rear dragster slicks, 60-centimeter wide Hoosier racing tires, scavenged from the ruins of a Lubbock motorsport supply warehouse. Their tread worn to a slick that gripped hardpack and blacktop with an authority that standard wasteland tires couldn't approach. The fronts were narrowed street tires, also racing heritage, creating the particular stance of a car that had been engineered for forward violence. The rear haunches had been flared with hand-beaten steel to accommodate the slick's width, giving the Camaro a crouching, loaded look, a thing gathering itself. The hood bore the opened eye and the old brown, not paint, that the flock called revelation, and that Crale had drawn himself one night without being asked, using what was available, not thinking about what it meant to use it. The trunk held the tools of the tithe in a canvas roll, buckled, organized. He did not think of them as weapons. Weapons were for contest, these were for collection. He drove at dawn and at dusk. The dragster slicks near silent on good blacktop, the whole machine communicating its purpose through its proportions alone. Wide, low, deliberate, indifferent to the feelings of whatever was ahead of it. He drove west on what used to be I-40 with 3 empty jerrycans in the back and a list in his head that was not written down because Crale did not write things that mattered. The flock needed fuel. The flock needed tithe. These were the same errand in the end. Chapter 3. What Crale Wears. He had taken the BDUs from a National Guard armory outside Amarillo in the 2nd year of the waste, when the soldiers in them had finished needing them. Urban camouflage, the pre-war digital pattern in grays and blacks and broken white, designed for rubble and ruin and therefore perfectly suited to the landscape the bombs had made of everything. He wore the pants, tucked into calf-high lace-up boots, military surplus, the leather replaced twice and the soles rebuilt with layered tire rubber that made no sound on concrete or hardpack. The jacket's sleeves were removed at the shoulder, exposing arms that were lean in the specific way of people who had carried heavy things for years without accumulating anything extra. Over the jacket he wore a molly vest, the original olive drab bleached by 3 years of wasteland sun to a color between sand and bone. Every pouch was accounted for, every attachment load-bearing and purposeful, no ornamentation, no waste. The vest's left chest panel held a fixed-blade fighting knife, a pre-war K-bar clone with a 7-inch blade, the handle worn smooth at the grip from daily handling, the edge maintained with a whetstone he carried in a thigh pocket and used every morning without exception, the way other men prayed. On the right hip, in a hard-shell retention holster attached to the vest's lower molly webbing, a pre-war .357 revolver, a Ruger GP100, stainless steel, which he preferred for its indifference to the dust and grit that killed semi-automatic actions in the waste. 4 speed loaders in the vest's right chest pouches, 6 rounds each. He had never needed more than one. At his left hip, on a loop of paracord through a D-ring on the vest, the collection instrument, a length of braided steel cable, 60 centimeters, with a weighted end wrapped in heat-shrink tubing, and in the right thigh pocket of the BDUs, the icepick. It had been a flathead screwdriver in a previous life, a heavy-handled Stanley, pre-war, the kind made when tools were still made to last. Crale had reground the shaft on a whetstone over several nights into a tapered needle-ground point, then annealed the tip with a butane torch and reground it again until the steel was dense and hard and would not deflect against bone. The handle he had wrapped in paracord over the factory rubber, building the diameter up until it filled his palm completely, and the grip was total regardless of wet or cold. The modified screwdriver looked unremarkable in the pocket. It was the most used tool in his collection. He did not clean it between uses. The patina it had developed told a story he did not need to read. Chapter 4. The Convoy. The flock traveled in 5 vehicles, and each one was a sermon in salvage. Behind the Camaro came Deacon's rig, a pre-war F-250 Super Duty that had been converted, with considerable violence of method, into something closer to a battering instrument than a truck. The cab was encased in welded bar armor that extended forward over the engine bay in a ram's head configuration, the bars tapering to a reinforced point at the grille. The bed was open, fitted with a bench welded from angle iron, and 4 of the flock rode there on rotating watch, armed with a combination of pre-war firearms in various states of maintenance and improvised weapons. The truck rode on oversized off-road tires, doubled on the rear axle, the dual-wheel setup giving it a planted, immovable quality on hardpack that made it useful for blocking and less useful for speed. Deacon, who drove it, valued blocking. Third in the line was what the flock called the Reliquary, a pre-war ambulance, the white long since sandblasted to a matte gray, its emergency markings still faintly visible beneath the grime in a way that struck most waste survivors as obscene given its current purpose. Its cargo bay had been converted to the flock's medical and supply function, administered by a woman called Sable, who had been a veterinary technician pre-war and applied her skills without strong distinction between species. The reliquary's exterior had been decorated over years with the flock's iconography. The opened eye repeated in various scales and mediums, surrounding a collection of pre-war objects welded to the body panels as relics: a child's bicycle wheel, 3 road signs bent into new configurations, the skeletal frame of an umbrella, a pair of eyeglasses fused to the driver's side door at eye level, looking forward. Fourth was the fuel hauler, a flatbed truck of indeterminate pre-war origin, its identity consumed by modification, carrying the flock's reserve jerrycans in a steel cage welded to the flatbed and padlocked with a pre-war lock that the father kept the key to on a cord around his neck. The hauler was driven by a man the flock called Stitch, who had earned the name from the heavy wax thread and curved needle he kept in a kit on his belt and used with the matter-of-fact competence of long practice on both canvas and skin. And last in the line, rear guard, always rear guard, came Mask. Nobody in the flock used his given name if a given name remained anywhere in him. The mask itself was pre-war sports equipment, a hockey goalie's mask that had been modified over years of wear into something that bore only ancestral resemblance to its origin. The original white fiberglass had been painted, scratched, repainted, carved into, inlaid with fragments of mirror glass and the finger bones of the flock's collected tithes, small bones precisely removed, affixed with wire and resin in a border pattern around the mask's eye apertures and jaw line. The eye apertures themselves were covered with amber-tinted polycarbonate salvaged from a pair of industrial safety goggles, giving the mask a jaundiced, insect-like gaze. A crack across the right cheek had been repaired with a bracket of steel bolted through the fiberglass, the bolt heads proud and deliberate, as though the repair were the point. Whatever face it covered had not been seen by any current member of the flock. Whether Mask remembered what his own face looked like was a question that did not appear to interest him. He drove a pre-war Jeep Wrangler that had been stripped to its frame and rebuilt as something skeletal and aggressive. The body panels removed entirely, the roll cage extended and reinforced until it was the vehicle's primary structure, a ramming spar welded to the front axle assembly from salvaged truck chassis rail. The Jeep's nakedness made it look simultaneously unfinished and more dangerous for the lack of skin. All mechanism, all intention, nothing decorative remaining. A salvaged cattle prod, wired to a battery bolted beneath the driver's seat, was mounted on the roll cage's right upright within reach of Mask's right hand. He had used it on vehicles and on people with equal interest in the results. Mask did not speak often. When he did, the mask's acoustic properties gave his voice a flattened, depthless quality, as though it were coming from slightly outside the situation. The flock found this appropriate. The father found it useful. Crale found it neither, and had long ago filed mask in the category of variables that required monitoring. Chapter 5. The Tribe at Wheeler Station. They called themselves the Steadfast, which told Crale most of what he needed to know. People who named themselves after their own endurance were afraid of stopping, and afraid people were either very dangerous or very useful, and after 11 years of collection, he could determine which within the first 30 seconds of observation. The Steadfast were useful. Their encampment at Wheeler Station, the ruins of an old agricultural supply depot, the corrugated metal walls patched with flattened cans and prayer flags made from pre-war clothing, was organized in the particular way of people who had survived long enough to build habits. Habits made people predictable. Predictable made them collectible. He counted 17 souls from the ridge, 3 on watch, rotating in 2-hour intervals, disciplined but fatigued, the kind of fatigue that accumulated across months and showed in the way a person held their head, that slight forward tilt of a neck that had stopped expecting anything good from the horizon. 4 children. He noted this not with mercy but with mathematics. Children complicated the collection. They made noise at the wrong moments, moved unpredictably, hid in spaces adults didn't consider. He would account for them. He observed for 6 hours, drinking slowly from his water skin, eating nothing, the sun moving across him without registering, his shadow shortening and then lengthening again. He learned the depot's geometry, the entry points, the internal partitions visible through the gaps in the walls. He learned which guard rotated early and which one supplemented the gaps in their alertness with stimulants. The particular jaw movement, the skin's bad color. He learned where the fuel was, a cistern buried under the eastern wall, the cap marked with a red rag. The rag's position checked compulsively every 2 hours by a large man with a scarred forearm, who Crale assessed as the group's primary protector. Probably former military, probably pre-war reserves, still moved like he was being graded on it. Crale took note of the man with the scarred forearm, the way a surgeon takes note of the most difficult part of a procedure. Not with dread, with professional anticipation. He waited for the hour of the dog, a concept he'd learned from a book of Japanese ghost stories found in a Phoenix library before the stacks burned. That particular hour before dawn, when the human body's resistance to despair was lowest, when the nervous system's confidence in the continuation of things became thin and porous. Then he descended. Chapter 6. Instrument Work. The first watch, the stimulant-supplemented one, jaw still working its phantom rhythm, never made a sound that carried. Crale moved along the depot's eastern wall with the flat, unhurried pace of something that understood geometry intuitively, staying in the shadow channel between the wall and the burned-out grain silo. The guard's pattern had a 3-second gap at the northeast corner, where his sight line broke and momentum briefly committed to the turn. 3 seconds was significant. 3 seconds was architectural. He palmed the icepick from the BDU thigh pocket without breaking stride. The paracord-wrapped handle, seating into his palm with the familiarity of a thing that had been picked up and set down thousands of times. The needle-ground point oriented along the heel of his hand, concealed against his forearm in the modified reverse grip he had developed for close work in low-clearance spaces. What the icepick offered that a blade did not was specificity. A blade was a broad argument. The icepick was a precise one. A single-point entry instrument engineered through months of Crale's methodical refinement to find the gaps in things rather than force through them. The reground shaft, hardened at the tip and ground to a taper that began 12 centimeters from the point, would not deflect against cranial bone or between vertebrae if the angle was correct, and Crale had spent considerable time ensuring his angles were correct. The guard sat down slowly at the northeast corner, assisted. The icepick returned to the thigh pocket in the same motion. The second watch on the depot's roof presented a geometric problem that Crale solved with the braided cable from the D-ring at his left hip. A solution that required patience more than force. The weighted end swung once in a controlled arc, and the cable doing the rest, and produced, at its conclusion, a sound like a question mark. Then he was inside. Chapter 7. Inside the Steadfast. The depot's interior smelled of people who were managing, not thriving, managing. The specific odor of rationed hygiene and shared anxiety and the particular body chemistry of people who had chosen, very deliberately every morning, to continue. Crale moved through it the way he moved through everything, without disturbing the air if he could help it. The BDU boots' tire rubber soles registering nothing on the concrete floor. The Steadfast slept in the depot's main bay in arranged pallets, the stronger ones at the perimeter, the children and the weaker adults in the interior. This arrangement was protective, and it was also, from a Crale's perspective, courteous. It organized the collection by difficulty, outside to inside, hard to soft. The large man with the scarred forearm was at the south perimeter. Asleep but lightly, one hand on the machete laid beside his pallet with the specific placement of someone who had trained himself to reach for it reflexively. His breathing had the monitored quality of a man who was always, even in sleep, a little bit on duty. Crale crouched at the edge of the man's pallet and watched him breathe for nearly a minute, not because he needed to. He had already solved the problem of this man during his 6 hours on the ridge. He watched because there was something in him that required this moment of observation, this acknowledgement of the difficulty of the thing before the thing. The father called it reverence. Crale thought of it more as respect between professionals. The icepick came out of the thigh pocket a second time. The paracord handle, warm from his body heat. The needle tip, its patina of previous work, catching no light at all. He used the icepick. The large man made a sound like a word he'd forgotten he knew. Then the sound stopped, and the world reconfigured, and Crale waited 15 seconds in perfect stillness to let the depot's atmosphere resettle. In the interior of the pallet arrangement, a child shifted in sleep and went still. Crale waited another 15 seconds. Then he began the real work. Chapter 8. The Tithe Collected. What the flock received when Crale returned to the convoy in the gray hour before full sunrise was what the flock always received: the jerrycans filled and the mark on the collection tarp. The jerrycans first, fuel enough to run the convoy for 2 weeks of careful management. The tarp's new mark applied with the same instrument that had applied all the others, Crale's hand steady, the line clean. The opened eye, watching from the tarp's top corner with its permanent, unblinking patience. The flock did not know all the specifics of collection. The father did. The rest believed, as the father intended, that the tithe was a spiritual transaction. The marks were prayer tallies. The fuel was providence. Crale did not think of this as deception. He thought of it as division of labor. Chapter 9. Odessa Red. 2 days west, outside the ruins of what had been Odessa before Odessa became a lesson, a woman named Fen was watching the horizon with the specific attention of someone who had learned to see things that weren't obvious. She was 23, which in the waste was a number that meant something had been consistently going right, or that she was very smart or very dangerous, or some ratio of the two. In Fenn's case, the ratio was approximately equal, weighted slightly toward the dangerous end. She wore what the waste made available, assembled over years into a functional identity. Canvas work pants in a washed-out ochre, the knees doubled with salvaged denim, the cuffs tucked into ankle boots whose steel toes she had exposed deliberately. The leather worn away there and left that way because the steel communicated something she found useful in first encounters. Above the waist, a sleeveless thermal undershirt, once black, now the gray of old smoke. The neckline cut lower than its origin to accommodate the heat. Over it, an open flannel shirt with the arms torn away at the shoulder, worn loose, its function primarily as a surface for the things she carried. A salvaged chest harness made from repurposed climbing webbing and D-rings, rigged in the improvised manner of someone who had learned load-bearing by necessity rather than training. The chicken butchering knife rode in a sheath at her left hip. A hatchet, short-handled, the head rehafted twice, was slung horizontally across her lower back on the webbing rig, within a single motion of either hand. Her hair was dark and grew without deference to any system, cut irregularly across the back with whatever blade was available when it became impractical. The front pieces long enough to tuck behind her ears, the overall result suggesting someone who had once known what a mirror was and had decided it wasn't relevant. She kept it back during work with a length of electrical wire, wound 3 times and twisted, practical as everything else about her. The tattoos had been done in the waste, which meant they had been done without proper equipment, which meant they were what they were. Blue-black lines of varying precision, carried with the indifference of a woman who had not gotten them for an audience. Both forearms, inner surface. The left bore a tally system in a shorthand only she could fully read, vertical lines grouped in the counting pattern, though the count was not of kills or days survived, but of something she had not explained to anyone in the Odessa Red. The right forearm bore a single image, larger, a hand, rendered in simplified anatomical linework from mid-wrist to knuckles. The fingers closed except for the index, which pointed directly toward her own hand. Below it, in block letters barely 5 millimeters tall, this one. She had done that one herself with a sewing needle and diluted ash ink on the night after the creek bed, in the specific state of mind that follows from seeing something that permanently relocates your sense of what the world contains. She led 9 people, and she was watching the horizon, and on the horizon was a vehicle she didn't recognize. Low, moving quiet. The dragster wide rear haunches visible even at distance as something engineered, rather than improvised, something that had been built with intention and maintained with care. Too quiet. Chapter 10. What Fenn Knows. She scattered the group before the vehicle was close enough to read detail. Not in panic. There was no panic in Fenn's operational vocabulary. She dispersed them in the spread, sent Wire and Amelie into the subsurface hide, with the group's only functional firearm, and 4 rounds and the drilled instructions. Then she stayed visible, deliberately. Rebar in her right hand, the barbed wire wrapped at the striking end, leaving her own palm protected by a salvaged leather work glove, the chicken butchering knife at her left hip, the hatchet riding her lower back. The Camaro slowed at 60 meters. She read its modifications with the accumulated literacy of someone who had spent 3 months specifically studying this vehicle from elevated positions at distances that precluded being read in return. The mesh windows, the boilerplate flanks, the dragster slicks in their flared haunches, the stance of a thing that had been designed to go through rather than around. The opened eye on the hood, rendered in a medium she had identified during her observation period and had not permitted herself to think about too directly since. The engine died. The door opened. The man who got out was wearing urban camouflage BDUs, the gray-black digital pattern designed for broken cityscape and therefore invisible in rubble. With the sleeves removed and a molly vest over the jacket, the vest's pouches arranged in the specific configuration of a person who had thought hard about what they needed where. Fixed blade on the left chest, retention holster on the right hip. The tire rubber boots made no sound on the cracked blacktop. He was lean and unhurried, and his hands were at his sides in the open position. And she read the open hands correctly. Not peace, not threat, but the neutral register of something that had not yet decided what the situation required and was comfortable not deciding. She held her ground. Chapter 11. Crale at the threshold. He had clocked the dispersion immediately. Good pattern. Radial, not linear, which meant whoever had designed it understood crossfire geometry. The two that went subsurface were the variable. He'd identified the hide's probable location from the disturbed compaction of the concrete apron. The woman in the threshold was the problem, and the point of contact. He stopped at 20 meters. The rebar with its barbed wire crown was a 4-step problem. The chicken butchering knife was a 7-step problem, and the hatchet at her lower back was a 2-step problem if she decided to close rather than hold, which she hadn't decided yet.
You found the creek bed.
She didn't react to the confirmation. This told him something.
How many in the convoy?
Also not a question.
8.
He said truthfully.
The father's flock.
A pause between them that was not uncomfortable. Two people in a hallway whose dimensions had been established.
You've been tracking the collections?
For 3 months. You work a circuit. Northeast quadrant first, then swing south, then west. 6 to 8 weeks between passes. You give any given tribe enough time to rebuild resources before you come back.
He looked at her, recalibrated.
That's good work.
Which he meant.
I know what you are. I know the Father sends you, because sending you is the only consistent thing the flock does that makes strategic sense.
The rebar did not move. The knife did not move.
I don't know if there's a version of this conversation that ends with everyone alive.
There's one version. It has conditions.
Tell me the conditions. You know the tribes. You know the circuit. You know things about the waste resource distribution that would take me another season to map.
He paused.
The Father values intelligence. Properly framed, you're worth more as a source than as a tithe.
And the version where that's not the offer?
Crale didn't answer. The answer was visible in the creek bed.
My people.
Your people survive under the same conditions. Positioned correctly, the flock is protection as much as threat.
She considered this for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a woman doing the arithmetic of survival and finding an answer she hadn't wanted to find. She whistled twice. Wire came up first. Then Amelie, blinking in the light, the GP100 stainless steel cousin held in careful drilled hands. Crale looked at them. Then back at Fen. The tally on her left forearm, the pointing finger on her right. This one.
4 rounds, and you stayed visible anyway.
It was enough to matter, if it came to it.
He studied her for a long moment with the quality of attention he gave to things he intended to keep.
Get your people. We'll reach the convoy by nightfall.
Chapter 7. The Father's Room. The Father received her outside the reliquary. the converted livestock trailer that served, through the alchemy of his presence, as throne room and tabernacle combined. He had rebuilt the trailer's interior over years with the patient acquisitiveness of a man who understood that power required staging. The floor was covered in layered rugs, pre-war remnants, prayer mats, a section of what had been a child's bedroom carpet depicting cartoon animals now worn to abstraction. And over these, pelts of indeterminate origin that the flock did not ask about. At the trailer's far end, a seat constructed from a pre-war executive office chair that had been elevated on a platform of welded steel plate and flanked by 2 oil drum torches, their flames steady in the trailer's sealed interior, throwing the back wall's decoration into shifting relief. That wall bore the flock's complete iconographic record. Every opened eye the flock had ever drawn, rendered in every scale and every medium they had accessed, surrounding a central composition that Crale had assembled from collection materials over 4 years without the father asking him to. A mandala of arranged objects, circular, hierarchical, its outer rings consisting of items the flock understood as relics, and its inner rings consisting of items whose origin the flock did not examine. The father himself was small, which was always the wrong conclusion. He wore white, always white, laundered by one of the flock's designated members using rationed water in a process that had become ritualized. The whiteness of his clothing being a theological statement that the waste, which turned everything the color of itself, had not turned him. A long coat in pre-war linen, sun-bleached to ivory, falling to his shins. Beneath it, a collarless shirt and loose trousers in the same register of white. On his feet, the same bare skin he wore for proclamation. His white hair moved with him as a separate presence, fine and weightless, and his face was the face of someone who had found, in the waste's elimination of everything extraneous, a clarity that read, at a distance, as serenity, and up close, as something that serenity was a surface-level description of. Around his neck, a cord bearing the padlock key to the fuel cage, a pre-war compass, and a single human finger bone, clean to a high pail that he touched occasionally in the manner of a rosary. He looked at Fen for a long time. She looked back without performance.
Crale says you mapped the circuit.
3 months of observation.
And you stayed after the creek bed.
Information is fuel. In the waste, it's the fuel that doesn't run out.
The father smiled, calibrated over years to look like sunlight.
The Tithe-Taker brought me something unexpected.
He looked past her at Crale, standing at the trailer's threshold in the BDUs and the Molly vest with the icepick in the thigh pocket, and the patience of a thing between uses.
Well done.
Crale nodded, the same nod as always, not agreement, recognition. The convoy moved west on what had been I-40. The Camaro's dragster slicks eating the blacktop in near silence, the dust rising behind the 5-vehicle procession in a column visible for 30 kilometers. The reliquary's welded icons caught the last of the sunset. The Jeep's skeletal roll cage threw moving shadows on the road behind it, and Mask sat within those shadows in his bone-bordered, amber-eyed face, one hand on the wheel and one hand near the cattle prod, watching the rear horizon with the flat attention of a thing that did not experience boredom or relief. Fen sat in the secondary vehicle between Wire and Emily and did the arithmetic of what she had entered and what she had traded and what she had preserved. The numbers did not resolve cleanly. They never did, in the waste. You took the best available answer and you drove west with it and you watched the horizon for the next problem and you did not think too carefully about the creek bed or what it had contained because that room behind your eyes needed to stay locked. At least until you needed it. The pointing finger on her right forearm. This one. She looked at it for a moment in the last light. Then she looked forward, at the road, at the dust, at the opened eye riding the Camaro's hood ahead of everything, leading the way into the dark. Crale drove point, as always, the engine idling at its low, quiet register. The dragster slicks silent on good blacktop, the road continuing in both directions, the way roads do. Indifferent to the small catastrophes committed upon them. Red, Tithe. In the Waste's oral tradition, the stories passed between tribes at trading posts and water exchanges, whispered as warning rather than entertainment. The flock's Tithe-Taker accrued many names. The Opened Eye, the Collector, Father's Edge. The name that lasted, the one scratched into the walls of depots and relay stations from Amarillo to Flagstaff, was simpler. It was a single word, 4 letters, and people who wrote it did not write it as information. They wrote it as prayer. The prayer was, "Do not let it be tonight." The end. Crystal chasm.